you for taking the time to be a part of this briefing. I feel like most of us, you have multiple options for Zoom meetings every day, and I'm glad you chose this as one of them. Special welcome and thanks to our presenters, who I will introduce shortly. I'm John Paarlberg. I'm on the executive committee of the New York State Council of Churches and also chair the Environmental Justice Working Group. Say a bit more about that later. But let's begin with prayer. This is a prayer for the earth, which was at the conclusion of a prayer by Pope Francis that appeared at the end of his encyclical Laudato Si. Let us pray. All-powerful God, you are present in the universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with your peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, for love, and for peace. Amen. And then I want to just give a very brief history on recently how the church has become involved in environmental issues, especially climate issues. In 1983, the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches proposed that member churches engage in a process of mutual commitment to justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, and that it should be a priority for the World Council of Churches. That was a recognition that justice for the poor, peace among the nations, and care for creation are all interconnected. Justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. JPIC became the acronym. In 1988, the World Council of Churches launched its climate change program, advocating for changes in socioeconomic structures and personal lifestyle choices in order to combat global warming. And this is not a particularly church event, but the following year, 1989, was the year that Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, was published, which was the first book on global warming aimed at general audiences. The following year, 1990, the World Council of Churches sponsored the World Convocation on Justice, Peace, and the Integrity of Creation. The first assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was also issued in 1990. And then in 1992 was the UN Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And the World Council of Churches gathered an ecumenical gathering, bringing some 150 representatives of churches from over 100 countries, which was kind of a parallel to the UN Earth Summit. Actually, I was there in Rio for that gathering. And then 10 years ago, 2015, Laudato Si was issued, the papal encyclical Care for Our Common Home. And that letter stated that climate change was one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day. and said, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And I think that's some of the background for the term environmental justice, a recognition that we must address both the injustice of poverty and environmental degradation, that they cannot be separated. As someone said, that the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth stem from the same wound. And many of the pieces of legislation we're going to be talking about try to do just that, address both the environmental concerns, but also the concerns of impoverishment, and making sure that in our efforts to combat climate change, we make sure that poor and disadvantaged communities have the resources they need to do that. So with that, let me introduce first Avni Pravin, who is the Deputy Director at Alliance for a Green Economy, which works to advance policies that decarbonize New York's residential homes and buildings, which both helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provides healthier and more comfortable environments for people who live in those buildings. And she'll be talking to us about GAP, the Green Affordable Pre-electrification Program. Avni, welcome.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you all for having me on to discuss the GAP Fund. One other thing I'll just mention is that AGREE is also one of the regional clean energy hubs. So that means we get funding from the state's Clean Energy Authority to educate our community about clean energy programs and energy efficiency and weatherization programs. So we have a lot of direct experience working with people who want to make these upgrades to their homes. And without further ado, I will jump into the presentation. So whoever's able to share that. Thank you. I think this might be not the start of the presentation. So the Green Affordable Pre-electrification Fund, it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's meant to help homeowners make necessary upgrades to their homes so they can get to what I'm calling the decarbonization starting line. So a lot of homes are in such a condition that they're not able to get weatherization improvements, or they're not able to get energy efficiency improvements. And unfortunately, the upgrades that are needed by those homes are not actually covered by existing programs. So I'll talk a little bit about what some of those examples are, but this fund would provide $200 million for the first year. This is conceptualized as it's almost like a pilot program. And the first year, we're asking for $200 million to stand up the program and start helping homeowners fill those gaps. Next slide. So where will this money come from? Governor Hochul put a $1 billion Sustainable Future program in her executive budget, or in her State of the State. And we're hoping that this will fund the GAP Fund, with future funding potentially coming from Cap and Invest and other sources. And this helps us meet our CLCPA goals, our climate leadership and community protection goals. It's the New York climate law that was passed in 2019 and requires us to drastically reduce our emissions and move to a renewable electricity system. And in the building sector, buildings are actually responsible for a third of all of New York's greenhouse gas emissions. So getting our buildings off of fossil fuels is directly related to reducing our emissions. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is we're not speeding up the rate at which we're moving homes off of fossil fuels fast enough to actually meet our goals. So this is going to help homes that would normally fall through the cracks receive help from the state. Next slide. So we do have some funding to make electrification and efficiency upgrades to homes. So there's whole home electrification and weatherization programs. There's heat pump installation rebates. There are energy efficiency upgrade dollars available. But unfortunately, next slide, please. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, there are many New York State residents that are not able to access these programs due to need of prerequisite upgrades. And those can include roof repairs, foundation repairs. If you have leaky doors and windows, those need to be repaired. If you have any kind of moisture control issues, if you have mold in the home, other toxic hazards like lead and asbestos or pests, all of those things need to be remediated before you can do any electrification and weatherization work. And of course, these are expensive problems to solve. And so many homes are unable to afford those barrier mitigations, and then they're left out of subsequent programs that would help them save money on their energy bills, be more healthy and safe and comfortable in their homes. Next slide. So I just went through some of these examples. One thing I didn't mention is electrical panel and wiring upgrades. Those can be really expensive, but they're also necessary for installing a heat pump. So the GAP fund, as we envision it, is going to be easy to apply for. It's not going to require a ton of verification of being low income to apply for. It's going to improve access to our electrification and weatherization programs, which can save people hundreds of dollars a month in energy bills. And then healthier homes, making sure that people are not living with asbestos or lead, or they don't have a leaky gas stove in their kitchen. All of those things are going to improve respiratory and cardiac health. And I believe, yes, so the actions that we have, I can drop these links into the chat if there's interest, but basically we're asking for organizational memos of support. I believe that the Council of Churches has already submitted one, so thank you so much for that. Other folks in here that have organizations that they represent, we do have a template to make it super easy. And then we also have an action for individuals that you can take yourself or also put in your newsletters and blast out to others. And that's all I have for you today.
Good. Thank you very much, Agni. We want to give people to take a minute or so to put a question in the chat or jot down as a note for yourself. And we hope to have several minutes at the end to have further discussion and questions. So if you want to jot down a question or put it in the chat, now is the time to do that. Next, we'll hear about the New York Heat Act, Home Energy Affordable Transition Act from Anshul Gupta, who is with New Yorkers for Clean Power. That's a statewide collaborative campaign hoping to rapidly shift to an equitable, clean energy economy. They focus on advancing solar, wind, energy efficiency, heat pumps, electric vehicles. Anshul is also retired from IBM as a research staff member, and he is also an active member of the Renewable Heat Now campaign. Anshul, welcome, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you, John. Could we have the
Just let me know when you want me to start the presentation.
Yes, we can start. Uh, uh, Good afternoon. So, yes, you. Uh, good afternoon. So, as most of you are aware that we are sort of seeing increasing energy burdens in New York State, especially with the with the winter weather the way it is, and the increase in the price of gas. People's heating bills are becoming quite unaffordable. This is a chart that shows the historical gas prices. The gas prices for heating have been going up, and the blue part in each of these bars is as corresponds to the delivery charges, and the red part is for the supply charges. So the while the the cost of supply for actual gas is at historic lows, as you can see in the graph on the right, people's bills are still going up, in large part due to increase in their delivery charges. Next slide, please. And this is sort of leading to uh, uh, a lot of discomfort and sorry, I have something on my screen. Yes, and inequitable outcomes. For example, in 2023, the last year for which we have the data, 369,000 low-income customers were behind in their heating bills. 46,000 low-income customers actually were disconnected, had faced a gas or electric disconnection. 1.5 million households in the entire state participated in some sort of energy assistance program, including the federal program, HEAP, or the energy assistance program, which is funded by ratepayers in the state, and which resulted in over $400 million in sort of missed payments. And these $400 million were then sort of that cost was shared by the remaining utility pairs. So this unaffordability of our utility bills, especially the heating bills, is impacting not only the low income customers who are unable to pay these bills, but it's also increasing the cost for everybody else. Um, Next slide, please. So we have a bill, the New York Home Energy Affordable Transition Act, or the New York Heat Act. In the legislature, it's been around for 3 or 4 years now. That would address every provision of that bill addresses energy affordability, in addition to New York Heat Act being a key CLCP implementation bill. So let me speak a little bit about the three key provisions. Um, the bill will direct the Public Service Commission to actually develop and implement a plan to meet the state's goal of limiting energy burdens of households to 6% of their earnings. This is already a stated goal of the Public Service Commission and New York State. The PSC has a proceeding on this, which started in 2016, but the PSC hasn't actually done anything about implementing this goal. So the New York Heat Act will essentially codify that goal into law and mandate that the PSC actually use all the tools in its toolbox, including rate design and making the rates more progressive to address uh, energy burdens. Then the New York Heat Act would eliminate sort of an atrocious subsidy for fracked gas, which is any new customer gets thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of dollars worth of mains extensions, service lines, gas meters, and gas hookup for free, and which of course subsidizes and encourages the use of fossil fuels. Uh, and the cost of this, which is anywhere from 200 to $400 million a year, is dumped onto the remaining ratepayers. So this subsidy encourages the use of polluting fracked gas, and at the same time increases everybody else's energy burden and utility bills. The New York Heat Act will repeal this subsidy. Uh, and finally, the New York Heat Act would amend the gas mandate, which is otherwise known as the obligation to serve gas, and which will allow the utilities to offer the most cost-effective home energy solutions. In the current antiquated public service law, uh, the gas utilities are mandated to to provide gas uh, for home energy to anyone who asks for it, and in many cases that is a more expensive option than healthier and environmentally friendly options like heat pumps or thermal energy networks. Uh, and the New York Heat Act will amend the public service law to enable the utilities to provide all the options and amend the obligation to serve gas to an obligation to serve heat or serve energy in a fuel agnostic manner, so that the most cost effective and the most environmentally friendly option can be sort of offered. And for and the delay in passing the New York Heat Act, uh, in large part due to intense lobbying by the gas utilities, is actually costing ratepayers dearly. So this is a sort of a Goldilocks law that would implement a climate law while reducing New Yorkers' energy bills. In his recent testimony at at the legislature's budget hearings, the chairman of the Public Service Commission actually sort of stated in unequivocally that a big reason why our energy costs are going up is that we are being forced by the current laws to simultaneously invest in the energy system of the future, which is the electrical system, as well as the energy system of the past, which is the gas system. And if we would direct our investments into a singular energy system and make it reliable, affordable, and resilient, we will have uh, sort of a healthier, more economical energy system, and we will save ratepayers a ton of money and address the energy affordability problem in New York State. Last slide, please. So here are some of the actions by which people can support the New York Heat Act. The New York Heat Act is facing intense opposition from the fossil fuel industry because obviously, if we reduce the use of gas in New York State, that directly impacts their shareholders' profits. And we need a very strong grassroots campaign to overcome the fossil fuel industry's opposition to this bill. So we hope that uh, that folks will support this bill. I'm going to put a few links in the chat to email your legislatures and join us tomorrow at Renewable Heat Now's Power Hour with the new assembly sponsor of the bill, Joanne Simon, and then finally join us hopefully for a rally and lobby day in Albany on March 19th. Thank you, and I'll continue putting the links in the chat.
Thank you, Anshul. And once again, if you want to take a few moments to jot down questions or comments, or put them in the chat, and we'll plan to discuss those a little bit later. Next, we will hear about the Stop Climate Polluter Handout Act from Suzie Ross, who is with the Climate Reality Project. That's the movement that Al Gore got started, I think. Is that correct? Climate Reality works to recruit, train, and mobilize people to work for just climate solutions. There are some 100 or more U.S. chapters, 11 international branches. Suzie is from the Lower Hudson Valley and is co-founder of the Climate Reality Project's Westchester County chapter. She's also involved locally in environmental organizations. She's an ambassador of Hudson River Keeper, a member of the Westchester County Climate Task Force. She holds a master's degree in climate science and policy and is a co-leader of the Stop Climate Polluter Handouts Act Coalition. And she'll talk to us now about that act.
Thank you.
Suzie,
Thank you.
welcome.
You can hear me, yes? Great, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. And I do want to thank you for the past support. You supported this piece of legislation last year. We're going to come back to you probably for a new memorandum of support because we have a new narrative. But this bill is very, very simple. New York State subsidizes the fossil fuel industry by providing $1.6 billion annually in tax exemptions. And I'll explain how that's done in a moment. This particular piece of legislation addresses approximately 20% of it, or 330 billion, and it focuses on the most egregious and harmful fossil fuel uses. There was an iteration of this in the beginning, I don't know if many years ago, but at least 3 or 4 years ago. This bill actually reflected the full 1.6 billion, but it was not palatable to many. And I'll explain a little bit more about the details of why it's focusing on the 330 million and how that is so justifiable. So how does it eliminate these handouts? It's basically an amendment to the tax code, to New York State's tax code. There are 2 areas of use taxes, a sales and use tax and a petroleum business tax section that actually allows the fossil fuel industry to take these exemptions. The important piece about this piece of legislation is that it goes after big oil. The carve out of 330 million recognizes that there's plenty of tax exemptions that benefit the public. Those tax exemptions that most benefit everyday New Yorkers would remain untouched, which is why it's only 330 million. And, you know, with valid concerns about affordability, repealing these subsidies, the 330 million that we're focusing on won't affect low-income New Yorkers. Not included in this bill, for example, are such things as residential heating, mass transit, farming and agricultural credits, for example. What this bill builds on, and why I think this is a really important year for this piece of legislation, is because it builds on the Climate Change Superfund Act, which hopefully most of you know about. That piece of legislation was an acknowledgement by New York State that the fossil fuel industry is culpable for their role in the climate crisis and that they should be paying for climate-related damage repairs and resiliency programs. It's indefensible to continue taxpayer subsidies to them, and we are grateful for all the work that was done behind the Climate Change Superfund because this is just the other side of the coin. You know, as both Avni and Anshul had mentioned, the CLCPA, New York State committed to a fossil-free future in the passage of the Climate Act, or also CLCPA for some of you that know that acronym, in 2019. So while unlawful, we know that our governor is showing really little signs of honoring the commitment or taking the climate crisis and its effect on New Yorkers seriously. She has backpedaled on congestion pricing. She's delayed efforts on cap and invest. And she truly has proposed anemic funding to support the things that we need to address the climate crisis in our communities. We know that we are going to have dwindled hopes for federal support. And so now is the right time to actually get this piece of legislation passed. And instead, you know, what we should be doing with tax exemptions is really truly funding true public benefit programs and needs. And I think that we'd all agree that tax exemptions should be really reserved for businesses that provide a clear public benefit rather than the world's wealthiest industry. Last I saw that the fossil fuel industry makes about $3 billion a day, and they're only going to do better under the current leadership in our federal government. And again, its effect, the fossil fuel industry's effect on disadvantaged communities is a well-known fact. So this bill, I think this is our year, and we are grateful for the support you've given in the past and hope to count on it in the future.
Thank you, Suzie. Again, take a minute or two to grab some questions. And Ruth, I think we'll have you go next to talk about the Renewable Capital Act. Ruth Foster is a longtime climate activist. She's co-chair of the Sheridan Hollow Alliance for Renewable Energy. Sheridan Hollow is a neighborhood in Albany. She also serves on the administrative team of Climate Can't Wait and is also very much involved in the Best New York. Ruth, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm happy to be here. These are the top bills in New York State this year. We're hearing about all of them, and I'm hoping that we can also move the Renewable Capital Act. So if you can share the slides. And I'm co-chair of SHARE along with Merton Simpson, who is the county legislator who covers Sheridan Hollow. And Sheridan Hollow is just literally blocks from the New York State Capitol. If you go past the State Ed building and down the cliff that's behind the State Ed building, that's where Sheridan Hollow is. If it was flat, you could walk it in 2 or 3 blocks. Anyway, so the Renewable Capital Act will require the Capitol and the Empire State Plaza to run on renewable energy within 3 years. The thing that we're also very concerned about is we want to shut down the Sheridan Avenue steam plant, which is owned and operated by New York State government. It's owned by the Office of General Services and operated by NYPA. And it has been polluting Sheridan Hollow for over 100 years. We want to shut down that plant. Also, the Renewable Capital Act will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, admittedly just for the one facility. But we also see it's important because NYPA has so many facilities. There's so many state-run facilities that need to be transitioned to renewable energy that we see the Capitol as kind of a model as to how the state can transition all the public buildings that they own to renewables. Next slide, please. And this slide takes a little minute to load. I guess my photos are too big. But anyway, so we have talked about Sheridan Hollow. The smoke that's coming out is coming out of the Sheridan Avenue steam plant, and it's blowing right up into downtown Albany. And these are some people who live in the neighborhood. Merton Simpson, my co-chair, is in the middle there. And there are high rates of cancer in that neighborhood. If you talk to anybody who's lived there for a while, they have a family member who has either has cancer or has died of cancer. It's really pretty outrageous. Next slide, please. So in 2017, NYPA proposed to put more frac gas turbines into the Sheridan Avenue steam plant. And you can see the photo on the right is the smokestacks of the steam plant, and you can see how close houses are to that. And on the left is a picture of our opening press conference in 2017 when the neighborhood came out to protest the proposal for new gas turbines. Next slide. Okay, so in 2017, we, Sheridan Hollow Alliance, called for renewable energy for the Capitol because we knew that was the only way that we were going to be able to shut down the Sheridan Avenue steam plant. In 2019, we won that fight, and the $88 million that was slated for the new power plants was put into renewable energy projects for the Capitol. And so they switched out some lights, they switched out a chiller that used to run on frac gas, now runs on electric, and they reduced the greenhouse gas emissions from the plant by about, they say 17%. So, but the problem is that of that 88 million, they haven't even spent it all. So we're really concerned that NYPA just isn't doing its job. There's still 25 million left of that 88 million that has not yet been spent. Also in 2023, 2 years ago, the legislature appropriated 30 million to decarbonize the largest state-owned facilities, of which the Capitol is one of the top three. And so there's been money putting into this project for a while. And the reason I'm pointing this out is when we go lobby, they say, oh, 3 years is just too fast. Well, this isn't 3 years. They've had money to do this since 2019. The problem isn't time, it's the will, and NYPA does not have the will to do this, and that's why this bill is so important, is the Capitol is not going to get transitioned unless the legislature tells them to do it. And the other thing on this timeline is we had asked for a study, and they commissioned a study in 2020. They didn't release it until 4 years later. It's called the Ramble study, and it proposes a 50% reduction in emissions over 10 years. And then in 10 years, so we're not quite sure when that is, in 2034, they're thinking, oh, well, then we'll start looking at thermal energy networks. So they're not even planning to start the process until 17 years after we started asking for it. So we're outraged. Anyway, next slide. Others have talked about the CLCPA or the Climate Act. It calls for 40% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030, and it calls for state agencies to be consistent with this goal. The state agency plan to transition the Capitol is not consistent with that goal. It's not even planning to start the process till after the 30%, the 2030 deadline, probably. And if New York cannot transition our own Capitol building, how can we expect the private companies to meet our climate goals if New York State can't even transition the Capitol? So the Capitol needs to be a model and a showcase and a training center for the state on how to meet our climate goals. And that's why we see this as a statewide issue. It's not a local Albany issue. It's a statewide issue. The New York State government is polluting communities of color, and it is really needs to step up and meet its climate goals. And we think the Capitol is a great place to get working. So that's, oh, and then the next slide, I forgot we have one more slide, which is just, this is the groups that have signed on to our memo of support last year. So if you would like to include your memo on our memo of support, we're handing it around. I know Council of Churches, I think, signed on to one or two of our letters in the past. We've been working on this bill for a couple of years, but if you would like to send me your logo, please just email me the logo and I will add it to our flyer that we're handing out. And our current plan is to, we need to push this bill in the Senate because the Senate sponsor changed since Breslin retired. It is now Senator Fahey, and all the Senate sponsors that we had last year dropped off. So now we got to get them back on the bill. So we really need help getting the Senate to move this bill. It did move. It got close to being on the floor 2 years ago. It did get in the Senate budget last year. So we think the Senate can be our champions and help get this done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Reverend Catherine Belkey cannot be with us this afternoon. She was going to speak about the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. I'll say a few words about that. But Catherine is a Presbyterian minister. I think she served a church in Hudson, New York, now working with Beyond Plastics and focusing especially on this piece of legislation and working on outreach to the faith community. As you know, plastics are a real problem. Plastic islands in the oceans, plastic waste, some 6.8 million tons of plastic packaging waste is produced each year in New York State. And in some ways, plastic recycling is a misnomer. There's only some 5 to 6% of plastic is actually recycled, unlike aluminum, paper, and glass, which can be more successfully recycled. It's not as easy to do with plastic, and much of the time, it's only delaying any plastic that is recycled. It is downcycling, because after 1 or 2 times being recycled, it's no longer possible to recycle it anymore, and it's brought to landfills or incinerated. It's also a cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Plastic is made from petroleum products, but the transport, recycling, incineration of plastics also produce greenhouse gas emissions. I read somewhere that plastic industry is responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions globally than the airline industry. So the only way to really curb carbon emissions and reduce plastic waste is to stop it at the source, to produce less plastic packaging. And this piece of legislation would require companies to reduce their packaging by 30% over the next 12 years, make the remaining packaging truly reusable or recyclable, ban the most toxic chemicals that are currently used in packaging, and reimburse cities and taxpayers for collection and processing of plastics, and prohibit incineration and so-called chemical recycling, prohibit them as counting toward recycling. And I know they are also, Beyond Plastics is planning a lobby day and rally, I think May 7th at the Capitol. Now, some time for discussion and questions. I saw one question in the chat, Peter, that you raised about the gap funding, if those funds would be available to churches. And Avni, I think you replied briefly, but do you want to say more about that?
Sure. So the bill is written fairly broadly to include a number of eligible applicants. So any owner of a building that basically cannot move forward in electrification or weatherization problems due to those pre-existing barriers I had mentioned, any owner of a building can apply. And then the bill also allows for municipalities and housing authorities to apply as well. So it's fairly broad.
Other questions, comments?
So I don't see any more in the chat, but if questions have come up for folks after, please feel free to raise your hand, either as an emoji or, and I'll just look for your hand.
I have a question for clarification. I don't know who wants to address this, but I've read that the Climate Act requires 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and also another statistic that requires 70% renewable, that energy use has to be 70% renewables by 2030. And I guess it's possible for both of those things to be true.
Yes, I can answer that. Yes, it is possible for both of those things to be true. One is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 85% by 2050. The 70% is renewable energy electric generation. So our electric generation has to be 70% by 2030.
Okay.
And 100% by 2040. So those are two different things that need to happen.
Thank you.
The 40% goal includes all sectors, buildings, transportation, agriculture, industry, everything. And the 70% renewables goal applies only to electricity generation.
I would just add that this is one of the reasons why Cap and Invest was so important. The delay of cap and invest, the lowering of the congestion pricing, all efforts to actually try to meet those goals have been, all I could say is anemic in every place that she's been working on this. And I think that's one of the real problems, which just makes the work that we are doing even more important, because these pieces of legislation will really help us without the stroke of a pen.
So John, you have two questions. One from Mark in the chat, and Peter has his hand raised.
Now,
In
Mark's question I see is a good follow-up to what Suzie just said. How can Hochul be better fact-checked when she presents herself as a New York climate advocate?
I can only comment on that and just say, I think we're all really trying to combat, she's got her own sense of disinformation campaign going. But I think that as far as advocates are concerned, this is what we're up against. I don't know, we have really good people covering politics in New York State, and she's always out there. I think everyone is out there, disagreeing or refuting things that have been said, but, we just have to keep up our activism.
Yes, and I just put a link in the chat to the Climate Can't Wait put out a governor report card. So if you want the facts as to how she's she's doing badly, there's a lot of facts in that report card about how bad she's doing.
What grade did they give her?
We gave her a D-, which is failing, but there were a couple things she did half-heartedly and many things that she didn't do at all.
And Peter, you had a question also?
Yeah, just maybe a smattering of a couple. So could you could you comment on what the problem is with the $9 for congestion pricing versus 15? Isn't that a positive step forward? And isn't congestion pricing actually doing what we had hoped it would do?
Anyone else want to take it, or? I'll just say, and I think, I don't know, Anshul, if you have any other additional opinions but you would eliminate more congestion if the price was higher, and you would also be funding more mass transportation, which would lower greenhouse gas emissions if more people were commuting and were being supported by the programs that increase was supposed to cover. There's probably more to it than that others might want to comment on, but that in effect, the more expensive something is, the less you're gonna behaviorally, so less people would be driving and it would be less congestion.
Yeah, I would just add that Hochul essentially wanted to kill congestion pricing, but it looked like that she was going to lose in the courts. So which we believe is the reason why she sort of came back, and she didn't come back out of any concern for congestion or pollution in New York City. She was forced to, and as Suzie mentioned, it reducing the price to $9 from 15 obviously removes less congestion. The impact on the revenues is a little uncertain, because although the per vehicle toll is $9, it's also expected that more vehicles will be traveling into the central business district because the toll is lower. So more vehicles would be paying the toll. So the exact impact on the revenues is a little uncertain at this time.
Okay. And the cap and invest, what exactly was supposed to happen with cap and invest? And what did the governor do that scuttled it or made it a lot less than what we had hoped?
So on cap and invest, the governor is just blatantly breaking the law. She's literally acting like Trump at this point. Um, by law, the cap and invest regulations were supposed to be rolled out by January 1st of 2024. They were already a year late, and their excuse was that NYSERDA and DEC was still developing the regulations. Now we know that NYSERDA and DEC had finished writing the regulations and they were ready to be rolled out, but Governor Hochul sort of put an indefinite pause on that, more or less. So the it will take about a year after the regulations are released for them to actually go into effect, because the law also requires a robust public comment, sort of a there's a public comment component to it. There is supposed to be two sets of public comments, and then by the time the regulations are actually enforced, it will take another few months. So if they had released the regulations in January, which is what most of us were expecting and they were supposed to do, then the program would have gone into effect by the end of this year or early next year. We don't know what's happening now.
So she's pushing a narrative that she is just putting a pause on cap and invest and not eliminating it.
Yes, but this is she's essentially refusing to implement the law. I mean, there was a deadline of
Mm.
January 1st, 2024 that they have sort of blown.
Mhm. Okay, and I have one more question for Ruth. You said that the renewable energy or geothermal, they pulled that off in Michigan.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah,
Is
and
that a roughly comparable situation to what's going on in Albany?
no, it's not completely. Their capital is a little bit smaller than our capital, but we're talking about the Capitol and the Empire State Plaza, which is admittedly a bigger project. But the point is that, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And the fact is we have been funding renewables for the Capitol since 2019. There's no reason why they shouldn't have a plan in place now. And it is doable. Geothermal is doable, and they haven't even looked at geothermal. And when we talk to them, I mean, it just, the more you talk to NYPA people, the more annoying it is they say, oh yeah, we'll look at geothermal in, you know, when we get to phase 3, we'll look at geothermal and we'll talk to Albany about putting it in Lincoln Park. Well, the fact is Albany ripped up Lincoln Park to fix drainage last year, and they've been building and digging it up for 2 years now, and they finally put it back together. So had they been talking to Albany in 2019, then they could have put the geothermal holes in when they had the park all ripped apart, and now they're proposing to rip it apart again. It's just they are not committed and they are not planning, and that's what makes us so angry.
Mhm.
So sorry, I go overboard a bit, but
Yeah, no, it's good. No, it's just, you know, I'm an Albany resident. I drive by there every day, and it just is maddening that with the technology that's available to us and the money that has already been spent and the conversation which has been had around that project for a long time, that we're so slow on this is just really, really frustrating.
Yeah, when they say they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% in 10 years, what they're proposing to do is move the Wadsworth lab out of the Corning Tower and into another building off the campus, and that will reduce it. So this is something they've been planning for 10 years, and it had nothing to do with the greenhouse gas emission goals. It's just because they're moving the lab that uses so much emissions, creates so many emissions, that they're meeting their goal without actually doing anything.
I have a kind of strategy question about how the New York State Council should focus its advocacy efforts. Do you know where these bills will be assigned, which committees? Are there particular senators or assembly people we should be focusing on?
I can answer really quickly with the gap fund. So because we're trying to get that in the budget, it is currently in committee because it's been introduced as a bill, but what is more important is pressuring the leaders of the Assembly and Senate to put it in their what's called the one house budget. So that's what we're currently working on, which is why the click and send action that I just put in the chat would be good to do.
I'll just say on Stop Climate Polluter Handouts Act, we actually also have Assemblywoman Joanne Simon on it. She's been really great, so I hope that she gives the support to New York Heat as well. Our piece of legislation is sponsored in the Senate by Senator Krueger, who also was the sponsor of the Climate Change Superfund Act. Because we've been working on this piece of legislation for a while, what we've learned are that there are some sticking points in the body of it that has hung up the central office folks. So our strategy right now is to get into some of the budget people. We're also, I think all of us are probably fighting for our bills to be in the final executive budget. So we're doing the same thing where we've already gone through priority letter requests and things like that. So, if mine doesn't make it into the budget, which I don't want to throw doubt out there, but maybe it would. Our narrative is different. And so right now we're just going to try to work with getting central office to understand the pieces of legislation and try to get over those obstacles and then go back and or simultaneously go back and start to assemble more co-sponsors on the Assembly and Senate side.
For the New York Heat Act, this is a bill which is the Corporations Committee. So, obviously the key pressure point is the chair of the Corporations Committee, which is Assembly Member Ed Brownstein. And then, of course, we want to target the Assembly leadership and the Assembly Central staff, including Hasty, Speaker Hasty, Majority Leader People-Stokes, and senior Assembly members like Assembly Member Paulin, Rosick. These are some of the senior Assembly members who are not enthusiastically behind the bill. So Paulin, Nili Rosick, Brownstein, People-Stokes. These are a few, and the Assembly Central staff.
Yeah. And for Renewable Capital Act, we're really pushing it in the Senate because we lost our Senate sponsors because of shift in main sponsorship. So we need more sponsors, and we are trying to get it in the one house budgets, especially in the Senate. For the Assembly, we're targeting many Albany people on this call. We're targeting McDonald. He claims to be a sponsor of he is a sponsor of the bill. He's claims to be a supporter of the bill, and we haven't seen him move it out of his committee, and we can't get him to budge in his committee. So the demand for McDonald is move it out of your committee. If you support this bill so much, prove it.
Good. Yeah, thank you all. Rashida put in the chat registration information for our advocacy days, March 3rd and 4th. And on March 4th, we'll be meeting at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Albany for a briefing like this, not only on environmental legislation, but economic justice, housing, criminal justice, a variety of issues. And then in the afternoon, we'll be making lobby visits with our senators and assembly members. And we're going to try to be setting those up pretty soon. So I'm happy to get some information and advice from you about who are some of the key people we should try to schedule visits with. Thank you all for participating this afternoon. A special thanks to all presenters and for your presentations and PowerPoint. I now have copies of those, which will be very helpful to me. I'm grateful to you for all of that.
Thank you.
And hope that you will be able to, at least some of you, join us on Advocacy Day on March 4th.
Yeah, please join us. And if you, is the link in the sign up in the chat? Okay, great. We all need to just kind of come together and support each other in a lot of things here. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
good job, you guys.
Mm.